In war, victory doesn't always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from illusion. The year was 1944. The Pacific was a graveyard of ships and men. Japan still held dozens of islands, each one a fortress, each one guarded by soldiers who'd rather die than surrender. America had learned the hard way that taking every island by force would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. So the question became, what if they didn't have to? Deep inside a top-secret base in the Pacific, a strange group of soldiers prepared for battle. They weren't your typical warriors. Some carried paintbrushes, others lugged microphones. A few even carried inflatable tanks. To anyone looking in from the outside, it might have looked like a circus. But to military intelligence, these men were about to pull off one of the greatest tricks of the war. They called it Operation Forager Deception, though it would later be remembered by a simpler name, the Ghost Army of the Pacific. Their mission was simple but dangerous: create a phantom invasion force that would make Japan believe the next American attack was coming somewhere else entirely. While real troops quietly prepared to strike the Marianas Islands, this invisible army would convince Japan the invasion was headed for the Philippines. It was the perfect lie, one so believable, it had to be real. Radio operators began sending out fake traffic, entire networks of invented conversations. They spoke of fuel shortages, landing rehearsals, and supply shipments. The messages were filled with coded terms only real units would use. Japanese intelligence was listening, and they bought every word. Meanwhile, on a tiny, isolated island far from the front, American engineers and artists got to work. They inflated rubber tanks, painted wooden planes, and built fake runways that glimmered under the sun. From the sky, the island looked alive with activity. Vehicles moving, planes ready to launch, troops drilling for an assault that would never happen. At night, sound engineers played recordings of trucks rumbling, cranes moving, and aircraft engines revving. To any Japanese scout flying overhead, it looked and sounded like an army gearing up for war. And it worked. Intercepted Japanese messages soon revealed their confusion. They'd taken the bait completely. Enemy reconnaissance planes reported a massive buildup of American forces on the wrong island. As a result, Japan repositioned parts of its navy and air defenses away from the Marianas, leaving the real targets dangerously exposed. When the true invasion began, American forces landed on Saipan and Guam with far less resistance than anyone expected. It was one of the cleanest large-scale assaults in the Pacific, and the deception had played a key role in making it possible. But for the men of the Ghost Army, there was no glory. They couldn't talk about what they'd done, couldn't brag about how they'd fooled an empire. Their work had to remain invisible, just like they were. One of those men, Lieutenant Harold Wexler, would later write in his journal, "We fought without firing a shot, but the enemy never saw us coming." The trickery didn't stop there. The U.S. military learned fast that deception worked, and it saved lives. Over the next year, they used the same strategy again and again. Fake radio chatter, phantom fleets made of lights, and false airfields that could be built overnight. Even the famous attack on Iwo Jima began with deceptive signals that made Japan think the Americans would strike elsewhere. To the men who served in those secret units, the work was strange, even absurd at times. They risked their lives building fake tanks under real enemy air raids. Some died never knowing how much their illusions had changed the course of the war. But behind every illusion was a purpose: to make the enemy see ghosts where there were none. And while Japan scrambled to reinforce false targets, real American forces advanced island by island, moving closer to Japan's doorstep. Each deception saved lives, shortened battles, and confused an enemy that once seemed unbeatable. By 1945, Japan's high command had stopped trusting its own eyes. Their intelligence reports contradicted one another. Phantom fleets were reported across the Pacific. Fake airstrikes caused entire divisions to relocate for battles that never came. The Empire's once dominant network of scouts and spies had been blinded, not by force, but by imagination. Somewhere on that lonely island, the men who started it all packed their gear and left quietly. Their work was done. No medals, no parades, just a few photographs, a few notes, and a war forever changed by shadows. They returned home to silence, their mission sealed in classified reports. For decades, no one spoke of the island that fooled Japan or the invisible army that never fired a shot, but won a battle of minds. They weren't remembered as heroes, but in truth, they were something rarer. They were artists who painted victory with deception. They made Japan fight ghosts and lose. Because sometimes in war, the most powerful weapon isn't the one that kills, it's the one that convinces your enemy they've already lost. The morning of June 2nd, 1944, began with a thick blanket of fog drifting across the Aleutian chain. On the island of Attu, the men of the Invisible Army were already at work before the sun even touched the waves. They moved like ghosts. Engineers, radio operators, weather observers, each of them knowing the truth about what they were doing and what they had to keep hidden from the world. For months, Japan had believed that thousands of American troops were scattered across these islands, building massive bases and preparing for an invasion that never came. But the truth was far stranger. Most of what Japan thought it saw was an illusion. On the distant island of Shemya, radar operators sent out fake signals to make the Japanese think a fleet was gathering nearby. Old trucks were parked on beaches with sheets of metal attached to make them appear as tanks from reconnaissance photos. Even campfires were arranged in deliberate patterns to look like full army encampments from the sky. This was America's invisible army, made up not of soldiers with rifles, but of men who fought with deception, science, and silence. Every false message they sent, every fake structure they built was a weapon. And it worked. Japanese commanders diverted ships and planes to defend against threats that didn't exist. They sent bombers toward mist-covered rocks, wasting precious fuel and time. While Japan scrambled to defend its northern perimeter, the real invasion was being prepared thousands of miles away, on the beaches of the Central Pacific. The Aleutians had done their job. The illusion had taken hold. But the work wasn't without cost. Life on those frozen islands was brutal. Men went weeks without seeing sunlight. The winds tore tents apart and froze food in seconds. Radios crackled with static, sometimes cutting out entirely for days. There were no medals for these men, no glory parades when the war ended. Their mission remained classified, their contribution buried beneath reports labeled top secret. Some returned home and never spoke of it again, not even to their families. One soldier, years later, would write in a letter to his son that he felt like a ghost who fought a war no one could see. That ghost, and many like him, played a silent role in the unraveling of the Japanese Empire. Because while Japan chased illusions across the icy Aleutians, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps advanced in the south, through Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, striking at the real heart of the empire. The deception had bought time, it had sown confusion, it had changed the pace of war. By the time Japan realized the Aleutians were a trap, it was too late. Their northern defenses were weakened, their resources scattered, and their communication lines strained to breaking. The Invisible Army had already done what it came to do. In the months that followed, American bombers would rise from those same islands, no longer fake bases but real ones, and fly missions deep into Japanese territory. The irony was undeniable. What had once been an illusion became a weapon of reality. When the war finally ended, the Aleutians returned to silence. The fog rolled over empty outposts, the wooden decoys rotted away, and the wind carried the last traces of deception. Yet the story of America's invisible army didn't disappear. It lived in the classified files of the U.S. military, tucked away and forgotten. Only decades later did historians uncover the truth. The Aleutian Deception was one of the most successful psychological operations of the Pacific War, a campaign of illusions that diverted Japan's strength and saved countless American lives. For the men who were there, the memory was both pride and pain. They had served a cause that could never be proven, fought an enemy they could rarely see, and lived in a world of fog and radio static where even reality seemed to fade. But history eventually caught up with them. Their invisible war became visible. Their silence turned into legacy. The Japanese Empire, which once believed it was watching an American invasion unfold, was fighting shadows. And in the end, those shadows helped bring an empire to its knees. They didn't need medals or recognition or grand speeches. Their victory was hidden in the fog, carried by the wind, written only in the mistakes of their enemy. And as the world moved on, their story became a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with firepower, but with illusion, and with the courage to remain unseen.